started. Welcome, everyone, to this evening's edition of Stories for Healing. As many of you know, this is a project that started at all days on Halloween, and it was really born out of a different kind of darkness than Halloween. It was recognizing just how divided and anxious and frightened and unhappy so many of us were and are. As a storyteller, I wondered what can I do about this? And the obvious thing was there, tell stories, but not just any kind of story. We don't want to hear stories about I'm right and you're wrong, or this is good and that's bad. We want to hear stories that open us up to seeing the world through another person's eyes, through recognizing healing, reconciliation, growth, and transformation. So it's been a really wonderful experience to have so many storytellers say, "Can I please join this? Can I please be part of this?" And it's happening. It's a wonderful, humbling experience to be part of. Tonight we have a very special guest. We have Flavia Everman, who is a storyteller from Missouri. And Flavia, please tell us a story.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And good evening, everyone. This is a story, actually, I read it a long time ago, and it's written by Lloyd Alexander, and it's called The King's Fountain. So once upon a time, there was a king, and he decided to build a grand fountain, a fountain that would rival all fountains, to honor his kingdom, to honor himself, and show off the beauty and the wealth of his kingdom. But in order to do this fountain, it would take all of the water from their village down below. Well, a poor man happened to hear this news, and he went home sorrowful. And he told his wife and his family, he said, "Alas, if the king builds this fountain to honor the kingdom, it will take all of our water, and we will have to watch our children die of thirst. All of our animals will be sick, and we will all die and perish." And his wife looked at him and she said, "Well, you must find a wise man to go and prove and tell the king that this cannot happen. Show him with his wisdom to change his mind. Go, my husband, go." So the next day, the poor man went into the market. There he found the scholars as they were debating this issue and debating that issue and talking all of these lofty thoughts, and all of these words were coming from their mouths. And the poor man, he stepped up and he said, kind sirs, kind sirs." And he told them of the issue with the fountain and what would happen to all of the villagers down below. And oh, the wise men, they said, and their lofty words sailed out of their mouths. Eloquent words, just magnificent words. And they wrapped the fellow up and they just pontificated all of their words. And the poor man didn't understand any of it. And after he got done, he looked around and he thought, what good are all of these words if you don't understand them? He said, I need someone who has like clear speech, someone who can tell the story straight out. The merchants have, they can string their words together like pearls on a string. Their voices and their words tell such stories. I will tell them, and I will ask them to go before the king and tell him the mistake that he's making. So there in the marketplace, he found the merchants, and he brought the issue there before them. And he says, with your words that you put together, you can tell the king, and you can convince him not to build this fountain. But their knees shook and they looked terrified and they said, "Oh, no, we could not ever do that. Do you know what happens when you go before the king? He will kill you. It is no. And the poor man, he thought, what good are eloquent words? What good are flowery words if there's no bravery to go with it? I need someone that is brave of heart and has the courage to go before the king." And he thought, and there was the blacksmith just outside of the village walls, hammering away. He was so strong and he was so built. He could take an iron, he could wrap it up into a knot as easy as a shoestring. he would be able to tell the king of his folly. So the poor man went to the blacksmith and he said, "Oh, great blacksmith," he said, "but here is our problem. We need someone brave and courageous to go before the king and tell him of his folly with the fountain." Well, the blacksmith was so angry that he took his anvil and he smashed it against the table. And he says, I'll go up there. I'll smash all the windows. I will tell the king. And he started throwing things all over everywhere. And the poor man, he thought, well, this man, he wouldn't even make it past the guards. They would kill him before he would even be able to speak to the king. What good is all of your bravery without wisdom to control it? There he was back to his beginning. So at the end of the evening, he trudged back home, gathered his family. The neighbors came over, and he shook his head sadly. I have found no one to go before the king. And his little daughter looked up at her daddy with the widest eyes of trust and faith. "Daddy, why don't you go and tell him?" And he looked at his child and he thought, out of my own blood comes the wisdom of a child. But how? How am I to go? I'm not brave. I have no flowery words. I have no wisdom. But the next day, he got up and he went to the kingdom. He trudged up that long hill to the castle. He got all the way to the edge of the castle and he looked at that looming building. His knees shook. When the guards saw him, they came running out with their spears and their shields and they surrounded him. And his teeth chattered and his knees quaked and he says, I have a message. I have a message to give exactly to the king. And when you say something like that, they have to take you to the king to fulfill your message. So they wrapped him up and they ushered him right before the king. And there was the king, sat in a great throne with a huge crown upon his head. And he looked down upon the poor man. And the poor man looked up and he shook with fear. And he said, "Your Majesty, your great and powerful Majesty, I have heard of this fountain that you are going to build. But if you build this fountain, it will take the water from all of the village down below, and we will all die." And the king rose in his chair and he says, "How dare you tell me what I can and cannot do?" And the poor man, he shook and he wished that he had the wisdom to tell the king what all he could, all the scientific knowledge. He wished that he had the flowery speech of the merchants, that he could string together these words of pearls of knowledge and wisdom, but he had none of it. His limbs quaked and his voice shook and he shuddered and he stuttered and he said, "Dear king," he said, I plead with you to reconsider." And the king flew off of his chair and he stood before the poor man. But as he did, and he saw this poor man ahead of him, he didn't see a rich man. He didn't see a wealthy man. He didn't see a brave man. He didn't see a wise man. He saw a poor, trembling father. And he thought about the words of the man, and he sat back down on his throne. And the poor man looked up at the king and he said, "Your Majesty, whether you are rich or whether you are poor, still must have water to drink. And if you build your fountain, look on it always with fondness and remember that you killed all of your villagers below." King sat there and he mulled over the man's words. And he thought about that fountain, that magnificent fountain that he had planned that would honor him and his kingdom. But then he thought, what good is his kingdom without subjects? And he thought the man was very wise. So he looked down upon the poor man and he says, I have changed my mind. He says, even though you speak from a poor man, even though you tremble for your lack of bravery, even though you have not wisdom or flowery speech, he says, I shall say that you are the wisest and the most eloquent and the bravest man that in my whole kingdom. I have changed my mind, and I shall repent and not build that fountain. Well, the man couldn't believe his eyes and his ears, and he stumbled back down the hill, all the way back down, past the merchants, past all the wise men, past the blacksmith, back to his own family. And he told them what had happened, and he shook his head. How could he be wise? How could he be eloquent? How could he be brave? But in the streets, the wise men, they told and they wrote down all the deeds that the poor man had done of saving the village down below. And they wrote them down in books in all of their flowery language, and they promptly lost them in their libraries. And the merchants, oh, their eloquent words, they're flowery in their stories. They told of this man, this brave man who had gone all the way up and approached the king and had gotten him to change their minds. And the blacksmith, he was so elated that he took his anvil and he threw it and he busted out one of his own windows. But his little daughter ran up to her daddy and she grabbed his legs and she says, Daddy, Daddy, I love you. So the story goes, not to the wise, not to the eloquent, not to the brave, but those who stand for what they believe. And that is Lloyd Alexander's The King's Fountain. Thank you for listening.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. What a great story. Wow. The power of words, but words not by themselves. Words
Right.
accompanied by all the right intentions and actions. It's a complicated world we live in. Yes. Where did you first learn that story?
I'm a collector of books, as you can see behind me. As somebody says, it's like, well, you have my own children's library back in the back. And I've always collected folk tales and fairy tales. And I've always enjoyed Lloyd Alexander's books. And I came upon this one in a library and I thought, wow, that is, it's not really a children's book, but it's just, and
Yeah.
it had lessons for like all time. And I kind of picked that one up and learned it so that I could just share with people.
Yeah. What a yes. And you can always tell a storyteller because that's what's behind them. A million books.
Your books.
You would see that if I took this thing down because I don't have as neat a bookshelf as you do.
Oh, mine's not very neat. As you can see, I've got books piled upon books and books. And so, but it's okay. I have books on the floor, but it's okay. I like
Yeah,
my
that's right.
books.
Very good. Well, again, thank you. And I want to remind everyone else, this is something we're doing twice a day. We're doing this really, again, for all the reasons I said before, because we need to be filled with stories of healing and reconciliation, of understanding. You know, the real power of a story is that it opens two sets of hearts. It opens up the audience's heart so that they can see the world through another's eyes. And it opens up the storyteller's heart because it does the same thing. We all inhabit the world of this story together and maybe get a new way of looking at the world. And so, just like Flavia has given us tonight, I invite you all to tell stories to each other, to speak to each other, to start to listen to each other. And I think that's the way things are going to start to lighten up in this world. And that's certainly my fervent prayer for all of us. So, thanks again. We'll see you tomorrow.